Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
In the late November of 1889, when the fog lay so thick upon the Thames that even the gas lamps along the embankment seemed mere phantoms flickering through wool, there occurred a matter which, for sheer singularity, has remained vivid in my remembrance, where many a graver and bloodier case has faded into the mists of time. Holmes and I had been for a fortnight idle of clients, though my companion's restless mind, which accepted repose only as a disguise for deeper contemplation, had occupied itself with an abstruse investigation into the migratory habits of a certain species of moth that had audaciously taken residence in Mrs. Hudson's finest parlour curtains. That period of enforced quietude was destined to end before the noon bell had sounded, heralding the first movement of a drama that would set all London whispering about the gentleman who never sat down. I had claimed the chair nearest our hearth, for Holmes, in one of his ascetic moods, had relinquished his customary seat to pace before the fire like a caged panther, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the dancing flames. The thick fog pressed against our windows like curious fingers, and I was drowsing behind the latest issue of the Lancet, when the stairs resounded with a pair of brisk steps accompanied by a heavier, more measured tread that paused upon our landing, as if the visitors were conferring in hushed, urgent tones. Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock preceded the sudden appearance of Inspector Lestrade's thin, eager countenance, flushed with an excitement I had seldom witnessed in that usually composed official. Behind him stood a gentleman attired in the sober black of a club secretary, his anxious, polished manner suggesting one whose daily existence revolved around the delicate machinery of social proprieties and whispered discretions. "Holmes," declared Lestrade without preamble, his voice carrying an undercurrent of barely suppressed triumph, "I have never brought you a prettier knot, and that is saying considerable after the Boscombe Valley affair turned my hair grey. If this is not the most singular corpse that ever defied explanation, then I have never encountered one worthy of the name." Holmes, who had been coiled upon the hearth-rug, with his long limbs folded like those of some great contemplative cat, his chin sunk upon his chest in profound meditation, raised his aquiline features without rising from his position. The familiar light of intellectual hunger kindled in his grey eyes like sparks struck from flint. "My dear Lestrade," he murmured with that peculiar mixture of amusement and anticipation that marked the beginning of his engagement with a fresh puzzle, "pray inform me at once that the deceased has been discovered in the act of doing something the living man never accomplished, and spare your theatrical flourishes for the coroner's inquest." The secretary bowed with strained propriety that failed to conceal the tremor in his gloved hands as they gripped the brim of his silk hat. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, sir, permit me to introduce myself. I am Horace Pike, presently serving as secretary to the Corinthian Club in St. James's Street. It is an establishment of considerable standing and discretion, as you will undoubtedly know. We have long prided ourselves that no unpleasantness occurring within our walls could not be contained within them through proper management and judicious silence. We find ourselves, I confess with the utmost mortification, entirely at our wits' end." Holmes glanced once at Lestrade's expectant face, once at the trembling secretary, and finally allowed his angular frame to unfold into the chair opposite mine. He steepled his long fingers beneath his chin and regarded them with evident amusement, as if they held secrets invisible to lesser mortals. "You do me an injustice, Mr. Pike, in assuming my ignorance of your establishment. I am acquainted with the Corinthian Club by more intimate knowledge than mere reputation. Its kitchen produces partridges superior to its library's literary offerings, which are, in their turn, of notably higher quality than the wit displayed by its governing committee. This unpleasantness concerns, I venture to surmise, a member of some particular distinction. Pike's carefully composed features betrayed his surprise at Holmes's familiarity with his club's characteristics. "Indeed, sir, Mr. Percival Statham." "Ah!" Holmes's eyes quickened with fresh interest, and he leaned forward slightly in his chair. "The standing gentleman of London society." "You possess the very epithet by which he was known throughout the city," cried Lestrade, his voice carrying equal measures of relief at being understood and irritation at being anticipated. "He who for the past decade has made himself a byword of the metropolis by his absolute refusal to occupy any chair at table, hearth, or social gathering, and for whom his devoted manservant had contrived those peculiar standing desks and elevated stools that reached nearly to the height of a mantelpiece. The very same gentleman, only now he has accomplished the impossible." "He has taken a seat," said Holmes with quiet certainty, "and in the act of sitting has somehow contrived to depart this earthly existence." Pike's carefully maintained composure crumbled entirely at those words. "It is as if Providence itself has chosen to mock our understanding, Mr. Holmes. This morning, at precisely 15 minutes before 7 o'clock, our night porter, a man named Larkins, whose sobriety and reliability have been beyond question during his 20 years of faithful service, was conducting his customary inspection of the club's lower chambers. The small reading room at the rear of the building, the one appointed with green Morocco chairs and those rather unflattering portraits of minor political figures, was secured with its lock engaged. This circumstance occasioned no surprise, as Mr. Statham habitually employed that chamber during the evening hours for his private correspondence and reading." Holmes nodded encouragingly, his fingers still steepled, his attention focused with laser-like intensity upon every word. Pike continued, his voice growing steadier as he focused upon the precise recitation of facts. "Mr. Statham possessed a key to that particular room through the special indulgence of our governing committee, and frequently remained there reading until the early morning hours." Larkins knocked upon the door, then repeated his summons more forcefully, receiving no response whatsoever. Placing his ear against the panel, he detected only silence, save for the low murmur of the coal grate, which had burned nearly to embers. Following established protocol, he summoned the steward, a most respectable man named Hartley, and together they resolved to wait until 8 o'clock before taking further action, accounting for Mr. Statham's well-known eccentricities and preference for solitude. "Most prudent," Holmes observed. "And at 8 o'clock?" The door remained locked, and no sound of movement could be detected from within. They called upon our cook, a woman of considerable physical strength and under the direct authority of the club chairman, who had by then arrived for his morning constitutional. They forced entry to the chamber. "And discovered Mr. Statham in what condition?" Holmes inquired, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Seated in one of the green Morocco chairs, Mr. Holmes," Pike replied, his own voice now reduced to a horrified whisper. "Seated as comfortably as any gentleman might be after a satisfying dinner, with the evening newspaper folded upon his knee and his hands resting upon the chair's arms, as if he had finally discovered the comfort that all other men take for granted." "But he was quite dead, sir. He had been deceased for several hours." Lestrade, who had been pacing the confines of our sitting-room like a restless hound, seized upon the narrative thread. "I arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of receiving word. Here is your perfect conundrum, Mr. Holmes. The door was fastened with the key turned from the inside and the bolt shot home. The single window, which overlooks a narrow service lane behind the building, was latched from within, its paint seal unbroken by any attempt at forced entry. The chimney, a mere flue scarcely wide enough to accommodate a chimney sweep's brush, showed no signs of disturbance. There exists no secondary door or any other means of ingress or egress. The only individual who might conceivably have gained access, Larkins the porter, is as honest as the sunrise and as thoroughly frightened as a child lost in a midnight forest. Holmes had been listening with his eyes half closed, his head thrown back against his chair in an attitude of profound concentration. Now he leaned forward, and the intensity of his gaze fixed upon Pike with the focused power of a lens concentrating. Sunlight. How long had it been since the reading room was last occupied by anyone other than Mr. Statham? Pike exchanged a glance with Lestrade, who shrugged his shoulders. "We have taken comprehensive statements from all relevant parties," the inspector replied. "The small reading room is customarily unoccupied during evening hours. It has fallen from fashion, you understand, lacking any view of the street and being excluded from the circulation of the port decanter. The last member to utilize it, apart from Mr. Statham, was Colonel Blythe, 2 evenings prior, for approximately 30 minutes before dinner. According to the housemaid's testimony, the room was thoroughly cleaned the following morning and left in perfect order. Mr. Statham arrived at the club yesterday at 5 in the afternoon, spent time in the main library attending to his correspondence, then requested the key to the small reading room at 7:15. He was observed no more among the living." "And your estimation of the time of death?" "Between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning," Lestrade responded grimly. "The fire had burned low, the extremities were cold to the touch, and the settling of blood had occurred in the manner typical of several hours' passage." Holmes's fingers drummed once against the arm of his chair, a gesture I recognized as indicating rapid mental calculation. "You mentioned there was no visible wound upon the deceased." "There lies the very devil of our predicament," Lestrade returned with evident frustration. "No wound of any description. No marks suggesting strangulation or pressure about the throat. No evidence of convulsion or the frothing that might indicate poisoning. There may be some subtle method at work, but precious little upon which to construct a criminal charge." "Subtlety, my dear Lestrade, is merely violence disguised in evening dress," Holmes observed with dreamy philosophical detachment. "What of the immediate surroundings? You would not have sought my assistance for mere trivialities, so there must exist contradictions apparent even to official observation. Present me with your catalogue of impossibilities." "I shall offer you one that caused Hartley to cross himself like a Catholic at Mass," Lestrade replied with grim satisfaction. "The chair in which Mr. Statham was discovered seated belongs to a row of 6 identical green Morocco chairs positioned beneath the portrait gallery. Hartley swears upon his mother's grave, and Pike here confirms the assertion, that the particular chair occupied by the deceased is never employed by any club member. Never, Mr. Holmes. It has acquired a reputation for being positioned in an uncomfortable draught from the window, so thoroughly avoided that even the cleaning women refuse to rest upon it during their labours." Pike nodded emphatically. "It has become something of a club superstition, Mr. Holmes. The chair positioned directly beneath Mr. Wyndham Price's portrait is considered unlucky by our membership. We are not, as a general rule, given to superstitious beliefs, but even the most rational among us develop certain peculiar preferences. Mr. Statham himself was known to pass by that particular seat without the slightest consideration of occupying it." "And yet he was discovered seated within it," Holmes mused. "Continue with your catalogue, Lestrade." "There was a distinct odour permeating the chamber," the inspector proceeded slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Not the scent of spirits or tobacco, but something resembling beeswax, perhaps mixed with other substances. Additionally, the ashes in the grate were not composed entirely of coal. Among the cinders were fragments of burned paper, charred beyond recognition, and a small residue of some substance that had bubbled when heated, leaving a streak that the steward identified as resembling varnish. I have preserved these materials for your examination. Upon the reading table lay yesterday's evening newspaper, folded to display the shipping intelligence. Mr. Statham's gloves were discovered in his coat pocket, and his hat rested upon the table at his elbow. The room's key remained in the lock on the interior side of the door. Holmes's countenance, which had been animated by boyish delight at the presentation of a fresh, intellectual challenge, grew grave and thoughtful. I perceive the dimensions of our problem with perfect clarity. If the room presents the characteristics you describe, we confront a sealed chamber and must determine the method by which our puzzle was accomplished. If Mr. Statham was indeed the man you portray, we face an equally sealed character and must discover the motive that drove our mystery to its conclusion. Between these two locked boxes lies our murderer, or perhaps our victim's own inexplicable folly. "Folly, sir," Pike protested, his professional dignity clearly wounded. "Mr. Statham was eccentric in his habits, Mr. Holmes, but certainly not foolish. He was a gentleman of substantial means and admirable public spirit. Only last week he presided over the subscription drive for the South London Hospital's expansion fund. He abstained from strong drink, avoided games of chance, maintained generous relations with his nephew, and treated his social inferiors with unfailing courtesy. I must respectfully request that you refrain from speaking ill of his character." "I intend no disrespect to the deceased," Holmes replied, and I detected that note of weariness in his voice that appeared only when dealing with well-meaning individuals who failed to grasp the distinction between personal judgment and logical necessity. "I speak only as the problem itself compels me to speak. We shall proceed immediately to the Corinthian Club, if you please. Watson, your hat and medical bag. Lestrade, kindly reserve your more colourful metaphors for domestic consumption. Mr. Pike, I request that you conduct us via the rear service lane. My colleague will wish to observe it, and I confess a particular fondness for approaches that receive little public attention." Pike's relief was so profound that he permitted himself an audible sigh as we prepared to descend the stairs. As we made ready to depart, Holmes touched my sleeve with that light pressure that indicated private communication. "You perceive the complete tableau, Watson," he murmured in tones so low that only I could hear. "A man who never sits discovered sitting, a room that provides no comfort made to embrace him in death, a door that secures itself while concealing its secrets. There is something almost theatrical in the arrangement, a performance beneath which the supporting machinery remains visible to the trained observer. We shall search for the stage carpenter." "You have formed a preliminary theory?" I inquired quietly. "I possess the foundation upon which such a theory might be constructed," he answered. "It may prove entirely incorrect. Should that be the case, you shall be treated to a learned dissertation upon the anthropological significance of furniture superstitions. Should it prove accurate, we shall find ourselves engaged in a most fascinating dispute with the accepted laws of physical nature, and Lestrade shall be compelled to consume his mysterious wax." As our hansom rattled through the fog-shrouded streets towards St. James's, and the waiting mystery, the thick mist closing around us like the curtain of some vast theatre before the commencement of a play, I could not dispel the peculiar impression that our entire city was holding its breath in anticipation. Among the countless faces that emerged from and vanished into the swirling grey, none seemed familiar, yet each appeared to be waiting with the same expectant stillness, as if all of London had taken instruction from a gentleman who never sat down. The service lane behind the Corinthian Club revealed itself as one of those narrow London arteries that seemed designed more for discretion than convenience, barely wide enough to accommodate a coal cart and shrouded in the perpetual gloom cast by the towering buildings on either side. The fog, though beginning to lift with the reluctant morning light, still clung to the weathered bricks and iron downspipes, transforming the modest gas lamps into pale, ghostly beacons. Holmes examined the cobblestones with the methodical attention of a scholar deciphering ancient texts, his sharp eyes tracking from the club's rear wall to the grimy windows of the opposite buildings, noting every detail that might bear upon our mystery. Pike produced a substantial key from his waistcoat and unlocked a heavy oak door studded with iron fittings, admitting us to a passage that carried the mingled aromas of coal dust, kitchen steam, and the peculiar mustiness that seems to inhabit the service quarters of even the most prestigious establishments. The contrast between this utilitarian corridor and the opulent chambers we had glimpsed during our brief visit was striking, yet Holmes appeared more interested in the practical details of the club's construction than in its social pretensions. We encountered the steward, Hartley, a careful man of perhaps 50 years, whose anxious demeanour and precise movements suggested one who had learned through long experience that disasters frequently announced themselves through the smallest irregularities. Beside him stood Larkins, the night porter, whose lined face and steady gaze spoke of decades spent in the reliable performance of routine duties. Both men were visibly shaken by the morning's discovery, their usual professional composure strained by circumstances that defied their understanding of the natural order. The small reading room stood at the end of a quiet corridor, its door of dark oak fitted with brass hardware that gleamed despite the dim lighting. As we approached, the peculiar sweetish odour that Lestrade had mentioned became increasingly apparent, a scent reminiscent of beeswax, mingled with something sharper and more resinous that seemed to catch at the back of one's throat. Holmes paused upon the threshold, his head tilted slightly as he inhaled deeply, his eyes half closed in that attitude of profound concentration I had learned to recognize as the prelude to his most brilliant deductions. The chamber itself was precisely as Pike had described, yet the reality of standing within those walls where Percival Statham had accomplished his final and most inexplicable act lent the scene a gravity that mere description could not convey. The single window looked out upon the very lane by which we had approached, its glass undisturbed by any evidence of forced entry. The green Morocco chairs ranged beneath their portrait gallery in solemn dignity, their very ordinariness somehow rendered sinister by the knowledge of what had transpired among them. The unlucky chair beneath Wyndham Price's portrait stood slightly apart from its companions, as if the superstitions of the club membership had invested it with a malevolent personality of its own. Holmes began his examination with the window, producing his magnifying lens to subject the frame to intense scrutiny. He tested the latch mechanism with gentle pressure, traced the painted edges with a fingernail, and examined the narrow ledge with particular attention to any scratches or marks that might suggest the placement of climbing apparatus. The accumulated grime upon the exterior glass showed no finger marks or disturbance patterns, and the paint upon the frame remained unbroken by any tool or implement. From the extreme corner of the window's rebate, Holmes extracted with his tweezers a granule no larger than a pinhead that glittered with an amber-like translucency in the pale morning light. This specimen vanished immediately into one of the small tin containers he habitually carried, though not before he had subjected it to careful examination through his lens. The door commanded his attention next, and he knelt beside the lock to examine the mechanism with the delicate touch of a surgeon. The key remained in the interior lock, precisely as Lestrade had reported, and above it the brass bolt lay securely home, its surface scraped bright by decades of use. Holmes ran his finger along the underside of the bolt and showed me a faint, pale smear that left a dull sheen upon his skin when pressed between thumb and forefinger. "Beeswax," he murmured to me in an undertone. Mixed with turpentine, as Hartley mentioned. Applied recently, I should judge, though not necessarily last evening. From the carpet's pile near the threshold, he extracted with tweezers a single fibre, translucent and barely perceptible to the naked eye, which joined the growing collection of evidence in his various containers. The fireplace drew his most sustained attention. Using the poker, he carefully separated the cold ashes and brought to light a bubbled ridge along the iron where some substance had fused and run during the burning. The peculiar sweetish odour seemed strongest here, emanating from the very stones of the hearth itself. Among the cinders he discovered fragments of charred paper, burned beyond the possibility of reading, yet retaining the brown edges that suggested they had been folded before their destruction. A pinch of the ash itself, carefully collected, revealed under his lens particles that glittered with the same amber quality as the granule from the window. When Holmes finally approached the chair where Statham had been discovered, his movements became even more deliberate and precise. He pressed the cushion with the flat of his hand, testing its resilience, then examined the tack heads along the underside of the seat with his lens. His attention was particularly drawn to the seam where the leather met the wooden frame, and I observed him run his nail along this junction with the careful attention of a craftsman inspecting his work. Upon the carpet beneath the chair's front legs lay a sliver of something pale and stiff, no larger than a fingernail. Holmes examined this fragment with intense interest before carefully replacing it in the exact position where it had been found, as if the floor itself were a document that must not be disturbed. When he rocked the chair minutely, it responded with the faintest click, as of wood settling against wood, and with this movement I felt a breath of distinctly colder air touch my ankle. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, though whether to himself or to our small audience remained unclear. Hartley, eager to demonstrate his cooperation with the investigation, volunteered that he had personally attended to Mr. Statham's final request for chocolate at 11:15 the previous evening, dispatching young Briggs with the tray. The cup had been returned to the pantry just after midnight, and no further communication had been received from the reading room throughout the remainder of the night. The newspaper was taken from the library at 7 o'clock. Larkins added with the precision of a man accustomed to noting such details. Mr. Statham was particularly fond of the shipping intelligence, had interests abroad, he did, though he never spoke of them in detail. Holmes nodded as though this information confirmed some private theory, then requested a few moments alone with the physical evidence. As we withdrew to the corridor, I caught sight of his face in profile, illuminated by the pale light from the disputed window. The familiar expression of intense concentration was there, but beneath it I detected something else, a quality of satisfaction that suggested the first threads of the mystery's solution had already begun to reveal themselves to his remarkable intellect. "Watson," he said quietly, as we prepared to examine the service areas, "we are dealing with a most ingenious mind, one that has taken considerable pains to create the appearance of impossibility while employing methods that are, in fact, entirely practical. The gentleman who never sat down has indeed taught us something new about chairs, though I suspect the lesson is not quite what our murderer intended us to learn." Holmes led us through the swing door into the club's service quarters, where the warm atmosphere of the kitchens provided a stark contrast to the cold mystery we had left behind. Here, amid the clatter of preparation for the midday meal, the familiar rhythms of domestic life continued undisturbed by the extraordinary events that had shaken the club's foundations. The cook, a formidable woman whose flour-dusted apron and capable manner spoke of decades spent in the management of gentlemen's appetites, received our intrusion with the resigned patience of one accustomed to the periodic disruptions that accompany positions of responsibility. Holmes examined the chocolate service with particular attention, requesting that Hartley produce the cup and saucer from which Mr. Statham had taken his final refreshment. Though the china had been thoroughly cleaned according to the kitchen's exacting standards, Holmes subjected both pieces to intense scrutiny through his magnifying lens, paying special attention to the rim of the cup and the shallow depression of the saucer. From the latter he extracted with his customary delicacy a minute fragment that caught the lamplight with a translucent gleam. "Briggs," said Hartley, summoning the youth who had delivered the tray, "these gentlemen require a complete account of your service to Mr. Statham last evening. Speak clearly and omit nothing." The young man, whose nervous disposition had been evident during our earlier encounter, twisted his cap between reddened hands as he recounted his final interaction with the deceased. "It was near 11:15 when Mr. Hartley gave me the chocolate tray, sir. I knocked upon the reading-room door, as is proper, and Mr. Statham bade me enter at once. He stood by the mantelpiece, as was his custom, reading a letter by candlelight. The newspaper lay folded upon the table, and beside it a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string." Holmes's attention sharpened visibly at this detail. "Describe this parcel with precision, if you please." "It was no larger than a book, sir, perhaps 6 inches square and flat. The paper was of good quality, and the string appeared to be new. Mr. Statham asked me to bring him a taper from the candle-stand, saying he wished to seal the string with wax. I did as he requested and withdrew, leaving him to his privacy." "You observed nothing unusual in his manner or appearance?" "He seemed somewhat agitated, sir, if I may say so. Not his usual composed self. He thanked me rather abruptly and turned back to his letter before I had properly closed the door. There was a peculiar smell in the room, too, like the polish used on the furniture, but sharper somehow." Lestrade, who had been growing increasingly restless during this domestic interrogation, seized upon what appeared to be a significant revelation. "This parcel, Holmes, surely it must have some bearing upon our mystery. What became of it?" "An excellent question," Holmes replied, "and one that brings us to the heart of our investigation. Briggs, when you returned near midnight to collect the tray, did you observe this parcel among Mr. Statham's effects?" The youth shook his head with certainty. "The tray stood outside the door as I expected, sir, but I heard no movement from within the room. I knocked softly, received no answer, and assumed Mr. Statham had retired for the evening. I saw nothing of any parcel." Holmes requested that we return to the reading-room, where he subjected the grate to renewed examination. Using the poker with surgical precision, he separated the cold ashes and brought to light several fragments of the brown paper Briggs had described, along with remnants of string that had been reduced to brittle char. The peculiar sweetish odour seemed to emanate from these very ashes, and when Holmes collected a sample in one of his specimen containers, the residue left a waxy film upon his fingers. "The parcel was destroyed," he announced with quiet satisfaction, "burned completely, save for these fragments that escaped the flames through chance positioning among the coals. Whatever Mr. Statham received in that package was deemed sufficiently important to warrant immediate destruction after examination." Moving to the disputed chair, Holmes knelt beside it and began a more thorough investigation of its construction and positioning. He tested the firmness of the carpet beneath its legs, examined the wear patterns on the upholstery, and ran his hands along the wooden frame with the careful attention of a craftsman assessing his work. When he pressed downward upon the seat cushion, I detected the faintest sound, as of some mechanism settling into place. "Most interesting," he murmured, though whether to himself or to our assembled company remained unclear. From beneath the chair's front edge he extracted with his tweezers a sliver of wood, pale and freshly cut, that had escaped the notice of the club's cleaning staff. This fragment, no larger than a splinter, joined his growing collection of evidence. Pike, whose professional composure had been severely tested by the morning's revelations, ventured to ask whether Holmes had formed any preliminary conclusions regarding the method of Mr. Statham's death. "I have formed several conclusions," Holmes replied, straightening from his examination of the chair, "though I confess they raise more questions than they answer. The evidence suggests a crime of considerable premeditation, one that required intimate knowledge of both Mr. Statham's habits and the club's physical arrangements. The destruction of the mysterious parcel indicates that our victim received some communication or object that precipitated the final tragedy. The mechanical evidence I have discovered suggests that this chamber has been prepared for some specific purpose, though the exact nature of that preparation remains to be determined." Lestrade, emboldened by this partial revelation, pressed for more specific details. "You speak of mechanical evidence, Holmes. Surely you can be more explicit regarding your discoveries." Holmes regarded the inspector with that mixture of amusement and patience that marked his dealings with official inquiry. "I can tell you that this room has been modified in ways that are not immediately apparent to casual observation. The chair in which Mr. Statham was discovered has been altered from its original construction, and the floor beneath it shows signs of recent disturbance. However, the full significance of these modifications will become clear only when we have established the motive for this elaborate crime." As we prepared to leave the reading room, Holmes paused beside the window and gazed thoughtfully into the service lane beyond. The fog had lifted sufficiently to reveal the rear windows of the neighbouring buildings, several of which commanded clear views of the club's private entrance. I observed him count these windows with methodical precision, noting their positions and the angles from which they might observe the club's activities. "Hartley," he said at length, "I require a complete list of all repairs, modifications, or improvements undertaken in this room during the past year. I am particularly interested in any work involving the floor, the furniture, or the heating system. Additionally, I should like to interview any workmen who may have had access to these premises during that period." The steward nodded gravely, though his expression suggested the difficulty of reconstructing such detailed records. "I shall compile the information you require, Mr. Holmes, though I must warn you that our records of minor maintenance work are not always as complete as one might wish." "Do your best," Holmes replied. "In the meantime, I suggest that this room remains sealed until our investigation is complete. The evidence it contains is too valuable to risk contamination by well-meaning attempts at restoration." As we emerged into the clearing London air, I reflected upon the morning's discoveries with a growing sense of unease. Holmes had uncovered clear evidence of premeditation and mechanical preparation, yet the ultimate purpose of these elaborate arrangements remained shrouded in mystery. The destruction of the mysterious parcel suggested that Mr. Statham had received some communication that precipitated his death, but whether this represented blackmail, threat, or mere coincidence could not yet be determined. "Watson," Holmes said quietly as our hansom carried us back toward Baker Street, "we are dealing with a mind of considerable cunning, one that has invested months, or perhaps years, in the preparation of this crime. The gentleman who never sat down was not the victim of sudden passion or opportunistic violence, but the target of a carefully orchestrated campaign that culminated in his death. Before we can hope to identify our murderer, we must discover what secret Mr. Statham carried that was worth such elaborate effort to silence." The fog was lifting from the Thames as we returned to our lodgings, but the mystery that had drawn us into its coils seemed only to grow denser with each revelation. The mechanical evidence Holmes had discovered pointed toward a crime of extraordinary sophistication, yet the human motives that had driven such elaborate preparation remained as obscure as the morning mist that still clung to London's ancient stones. Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes immediately arranged his chemical apparatus with the methodical precision that marked the beginning of his most complex analyses. The amber-like granules from the window, the waxy residue from the fireplace, and the various fibres he had collected were subjected to a series of tests that filled our sitting room with acrid vapours and the sharp scent of reagents. I watched as he dissolved one of the translucent fragments in alcohol, warmed it gently over his spirit lamp, and observed its behaviour through his magnifying lens. "Rosin," he announced, with quiet satisfaction, "mixed with shellac and refined beeswax to create a compound both adhesive and resistant to abrasion. This is not the crude wax employed by housemaids, Watson, but the sophisticated preparation used by craftsmen for French polishing and the treatment of mechanical apparatus. Its presence at both window and hearth suggests the passage of treated cord or wire designed to operate under considerable tension without fraying." The chemical analysis was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson's announcement of visitors, and we were soon joined by a young gentleman whose bearing and features immediately proclaimed his relationship to the deceased. Mr. Geoffrey Statham possessed the same aquiline nose and intelligent eyes that had distinguished his uncle, though his manner carried none of that peculiar tension that had marked Percival Statham's final years. Accompanying him was a gentleman of legal bearing who introduced himself as Mr. Alaric Dunn of Fenton, Dunn and Perks, solicitors to the deceased. Geoffrey Statham's grief appeared entirely genuine, unmarked by the calculating avarice that so often accompanies unexpected inheritance. He spoke of his uncle with a mixture of affection and bewilderment that suggested long familiarity with eccentricity without true understanding of its origins. Uncle Percival's refusal to sit began approximately 10 years ago, he explained in response to Holmes's careful questioning. He would never provide a complete explanation, saying only that he had learned something about chairs that made their use inadvisable for a man in his position. At first, we attributed it to some minor injury or discomfort, but as the years passed, it became clear that his aversion was rooted in something far more profound than physical inconvenience. Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "Did you observe any other changes in your uncle's behaviour during this period?" "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, he became increasingly secretive about his business affairs, dismissed his long-time valet in favour of a man with military experience, and began varying his daily routine in seemingly random patterns. He installed new locks throughout his residence and insisted that all correspondence be delivered directly to his hand. Most significantly, he seemed to live under a constant apprehension, as though he expected some terrible event to befall him at any moment." Mr. Dunn, with the precise manner of his profession, added details regarding the deceased's financial circumstances. "Mr. Statham's estate is substantial but not extraordinary, consisting primarily of investments in shipping and railway ventures. The testament places the inheritance in trust, with the income to Mr. Geoffrey and, failing him, to certain charitable institutions. There exist adequate funds to discharge a gentleman's reasonable obligations, but nothing approaching the vast fortune that popular rumour attributed to him." Geoffrey's expression grew troubled as he recalled his final meeting with his uncle. He had received a parcel by private messenger, square and flat like a book, wrapped in brown paper. After examining its contents, he became greatly agitated and spoke of matters too dangerous to involve anyone else. When I offered my assistance, he became quite angry and insisted that I must never attempt to investigate his affairs should anything happen to him. I fear those words may have represented a genuine premonition of disaster. Holmes made careful notes of these revelations, paying particular attention to the timing of recent events. His inquiries revealed that Percival Statham had maintained few social connections in Recent years, though, one friendship had persisted despite his increasing reclusiveness. A gentleman named Whitmore, apparently engaged in maritime commerce, had continued to call upon him regularly, their conversations always conducted behind closed doors. As our visitors prepared to depart, Lestrade arrived with a folder of documents that brought a gleam of satisfaction to Holmes's eyes. The inspector had obtained detailed records of recent work performed at the Corinthian Club, including the employment of Vardon and Blundell, French polishers, in the small reading room 10 days prior to the tragedy. The work order, signed by a journeyman named Cribbs, had involved the restoration of the Morocco chairs and the application of protective wax to the floor. Additionally, 2 days later, a gasfitter from Moffat and Company had examined the heating system beneath the hearth, responding to a complaint of uncomfortable draughts lodged by Colonel Blythe. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, examining the work orders with his lens. "The timing suggests careful coordination, and the nature of the work aligns perfectly with the physical evidence we discovered. Our carpenter, as I suspected, is indeed an artist, and his preparations have been months in the making." As the afternoon light began to fade, Holmes returned to his chemical analysis with renewed energy, subjecting the specimens to increasingly sophisticated tests. The results appeared to confirm his developing theory, for I observed him making extensive notes in the private cipher he employed for his most sensitive observations. "Watson," he said at length, looking up from his microscope with an expression of grim certainty, "we're confronting a crime that represents the culmination of years of careful planning. The evidence suggests our murderer possessed intimate knowledge of both Mr. Statham's habits and his fears, exploiting both to create circumstances that would appear impossible to ordinary investigation. The mechanical preparations I discovered were designed not merely to kill, but to kill in a manner that would confound the very foundations of logical deduction." The complexity of the mystery seemed to deepen with each revelation, yet I detected in Holmes's manner the quiet confidence that marked his approach to even the most challenging puzzles. The locked room, the impossible posture, the elaborate preparations, all pointed toward a mind of extraordinary cunning, one that had invested considerable time and effort in the creation of what appeared to be the perfect crime. Evening had scarcely drawn its grey veil across Baker Street when Holmes dispatched a telegram and 2 carefully worded notes with the purposeful energy that always preceded his most decisive actions. The first summoned Lestrade to pursue the whereabouts of the journeyman Cribbs with all available resources, while the second requested permission from Geoffrey Statham to examine his uncle's private papers. As we awaited the replies, Holmes arranged a practical demonstration that illuminated the mechanical principles underlying our mystery. He positioned a stout chair against our sitting-room wall and secured a temporary bolt to the cupboard door with 2 brass screws. From his desk drawer he produced a coil of fine cord, treating it with a careful application of the rosin and wax compound he had identified from the crime scene. Through a series of delicate manipulations, he demonstrated how the bolt could be drawn home from a distance, leaving only the faintest smear of wax upon the metal surface. A touch of flame consumed the evidence entirely, leaving no trace of the mechanism that had secured the door. "The locked room presents no mystery to one who understands the properties of treated cord and the principles of leverage," he observed with quiet satisfaction. Our adversary possessed both the technical knowledge and the patience to prepare his trap with meticulous care. The replies to his communications arrived within the hour, granting us admission to the Rutland Gate residence and promising Lestrade's immediate attention to the missing craftsman. Percival Statham's house proved to be a monument to the peculiar accommodations that wealth could provide to eccentricity. We were received by Amos Reed, a tall, spare man whose military bearing and precise speech immediately proclaimed his background in Her Majesty's service. For 3 years, he had served as Statham's personal attendant, adapting with soldierly efficiency to his employer's unusual requirements. The study had been arranged entirely for a man who refused to sit, featuring a tall escritoire with sloping surface, an adjustable lectern, and a high stool designed for leaning rather than repose. Holmes examined the escritoire with particular attention, noting the recent Brahma lock and the contents of its secured drawers. Among the carefully docketed correspondence lay a clipping from the previous day's shipping intelligence, marked in pencil against the arrival of the bark Thessaly from Paramaribo. A tin of sealing wax, amber-hued rather than the customary scarlet, confirmed Holmes's chemical analysis of the residue found in the club's fireplace. Reed's account of recent events provided crucial insights into his master's final days. Mr. Whitmore had visited twice in the preceding week, the second interview extending beyond an hour and producing what Reed described as the unmistakable cadence of heated discussion. Through the closed door, he had distinguished the words manifest, liability, and what sounded distinctly like Thessaly. The flat parcel that arrived that evening had been intercepted by Statham himself, who immediately retired to his study and burned its contents, leaving the sharp, resinous scent that had lingered until morning. Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Whitmore himself, whose weathered countenance and steady gaze spoke of a lifetime spent in maritime pursuits. His manner carried an undercurrent of anxiety that suggested our inquiry had touched upon matters of considerable personal concern. After the preliminary courtesies, he settled into his chair with the careful deliberation of a man choosing his words with extreme precision. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice measured and grave, "Geoffrey Statham has informed me of your investigation, and I fear my friendship with Percival may have inadvertently contributed to his tragic end. There are certain facts regarding our business relationship that you should know." Holmes received this opening with encouraging attention, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that familiar attitude of concentrated interest. Whitmore proceeded to describe their partnership in exotic import ventures, particularly the acquisition of rare materials and artifacts from the Far East. 3 years prior, one of their vessels had carried from Singapore a collection of mechanical curiosities, including what he termed furniture of unusual design created by Chinese artisans for purposes that extended far beyond mere comfort. Among these items was a chair of extraordinary and sinister ingenuity, Whitmore continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It appeared entirely conventional in its external aspects, upholstered in fine leather and constructed with solid craftsmanship. However, its internal mechanisms incorporated springs, levers, and counterweights that could be activated by external manipulation to create effects ranging from gentle adjustment to fatal compression. Holmes leaned forward with predatory intensity as Whitmore described the chair's diabolical purpose as an execution device designed to eliminate victims while maintaining the appearance of natural death. The mechanisms would gradually increase pressure upon vital points until consciousness was lost and death ensued, leaving observers to conclude that the victim had simply expired peacefully. Percival acquired the entire collection for private study, Whitmore explained, fascinated by the mechanical principles involved. He commissioned reproductions from skilled craftsmen, believing that knowledge of such devices would protect him from their employment by hostile parties. His theory, which I initially dismissed as paranoid delusion, was that someone sought to eliminate him using methods derived from his own collection. The conversation was interrupted by Lestrade's arrival, his excited manner suggesting significant developments in the official investigation. The inspector carried confirmation from the Singapore authorities that several items from the mechanical collection had been reported stolen during the vessel's homeward journey, including the very chair mechanism Whitmore had described. The theft had occurred during a stop at Port Said, where additional crew members had been engaged for the final passage to London. Among these temporary hands was listed one Thomas Cribbs, described as a carpenter with experience in furniture modification. Lestrade's subsequent inquiries had traced the French polishers to Clerkenwell, where Varden and Blundell confirmed that Cribbs had led the Corinthian Club contract before disappearing 3 days past. Most significantly, a lodging-house keeper in Duke's Court reported that a quiet gentleman, calling himself Mr. James, had rented a back garret overlooking the club's service lane during the precise period of the polishing work, departing on the morning after Statham's death and leaving behind a length of fishing line treated with resinous preparation. "The fellow's as good as captured," Lestrade declared with satisfaction. "We have him connected to both the theft and the murder scene. It's merely a matter of tracking him down." Holmes regarded the inspector with an expression that combined approval of his industry with reservation regarding his conclusions. "Pursue Cribbs by all means, my dear Lestrade, for he is undoubtedly a key figure in our drama. Yet remember that a skilled carpenter does not undertake such elaborate work without detailed specifications from his employer. We are dealing with a mind that chose both its agent and its theatre with equal care." As our visitors departed, Holmes returned to his chemical apparatus with renewed purpose, but I detected in his manner the quiet confidence that marked his approach to problems whose solutions had begun to crystallize in his remarkable intellect. The locked room that had seemed impossible now revealed itself as merely the final movement of a symphony that had begun in distant Singapore and culminated in the respectable precincts of St. James's Street. "Watson," he said, as the evening light faded beyond our windows, "we are confronting criminals of extraordinary patience and sophistication, ones who have transformed the very furniture of civilization into instruments of death. The gentleman who never sat down was not the victim of his own eccentricity, but of adversaries who understood his fears better than he understood them himself. Our task now is to determine whether Thomas Cribbs represents the architect of this conspiracy or merely its most visible agent in a drama whose final act may yet claim additional victims." The mechanical evidence, the historical context, and the human motivations were beginning to align like the components of some vast and intricate clockwork, and I sensed that the complete revelation of this extraordinary crime could not be long delayed. Holmes was not content to allow the trail to cool with nightfall. Within the hour we found ourselves in Duke's Court, where the narrow lodging-house stood like a watchful sentinel overlooking the club's service lane. The landlady, a sharp-eyed woman whose suspicious manner suggested long experience with tenants who preferred anonymity, admitted us with considerable reluctance. Mr. James, she confirmed, had departed at dawn, leaving behind only the faint scent of resin and a single length of fishing line that had somehow escaped his otherwise meticulous attention to detail. The back garret commanded a perfect view of the Corinthian Club's rear entrance, and Holmes immediately positioned himself at the window to examine the mechanical arrangements our quarry had employed. The window frame bore a shallow notch, recently cut and dressed with amber polish, while a brass curtain ring had been repositioned to serve as an improvised fairlead. The sill itself retained traces of the same rosin compound we had discovered throughout our investigation, and Holmes demonstrated with quiet satisfaction how a treated cord could be passed through this system to operate the reading room's lock and bolt from a distance. "Observe the precision of these modifications," he murmured, tracing the cord's theoretical path with his finger. Our adversary possessed not only the technical knowledge to devise this system, but the patience to test and refine its operation until success was assured. This represents months of careful preparation, not the improvised desperation of common criminality. While Holmes completed his examination of the mechanical evidence, I pursued inquiries at the nearby docks regarding the Thessaly's recent arrival from Paramaribo. The shipping clerks, though initially reluctant to discuss cargo manifests with unofficial inquirers, proved more forthcoming when presented with one of Holmes's carefully crafted letters of introduction. Captain Davies, a weathered mariner, whose honest countenance inspired confidence, recalled one passenger whose behaviour had struck him as particularly noteworthy during the Atlantic crossing. A scholarly gentleman, the captain explained, who paid his passage in foreign gold and insisted upon a cabin with no direct deck access. He carried only a small wooden box, heavily strapped, and a walking stick carved with serpentine designs. Spent most of the voyage in his quarters, emerging only for meals, and spoke with what I took to be a continental accent when pressed for conversation. This description immediately captured Holmes's intense interest when I reported it upon my return to Duke's Court. The combination of scholarly demeanour, exotic walking stick, and secretive behaviour suggested an adversary whose sophistication far exceeded that of a mere carpenter, however skilled. Holmes made careful notes of these details, paying particular attention to the timing of the passenger's arrival and his apparent familiarity with London's geography. Our investigation was interrupted by Lestrade's arrival with news that transformed the entire complexion of our case. Thomas Cribbs had been discovered dead in a rented room off Saffron Hill, apparently overcome by coal gas in circumstances that suggested deliberate self-destruction. However, Holmes's examination of the scene revealed evidence that contradicted this convenient conclusion. The gas tap had been forced beyond its natural stop using tools that Cribbs as a carpenter would not have possessed, and the sealing of the windows had been accomplished with knots that betrayed a seaman's expertise rather than a craftsman's improvisation. "We have lost our instrument," Holmes observed grimly, "but gained confirmation that we face adversaries who eliminate their accomplices with the same methodical precision they employ in their primary crimes. Cribbs was murdered to prevent his testimony from revealing the full scope of this conspiracy." The discovery of Cribbs's death was followed immediately by intelligence that elevated our investigation from intellectual puzzle to immediate personal danger. A note addressed to Whitmore, written in an angular hand and bearing only the initial K, requested a meeting on the Adelphi Terrace to discuss matters arising from the Thessaly manifest. The paper carried the same faint scent of lemon and tar that had characterized other communications in our case, and Geoffrey Statham reported being followed through the streets by an unknown man whose surveillance had ceased only when he entered a well-lit public establishment. Holmes's response to these developments was characteristically decisive. He arranged for Geoffrey's immediate protection, while simultaneously preparing to intercept the mysterious correspondent who had revealed himself through his own overconfidence. The mechanical genius who had devised Percival Statham's death was now moving to eliminate the remaining witnesses to his conspiracy, but his very boldness provided opportunities for those prepared to exploit his methods against him. "Watson," Holmes said as evening shadows gathered across London's ancient stones, "we have progressed from locked rooms to locked minds, and our adversary has revealed himself to be a scholar of death whose education extends far beyond the mechanical arts. Tonight we shall discover whether his continental sophistication can withstand the focused application of English logic, or whether the gentleman who never sat down shall be avenged by those who refuse to stand aside." The fog was beginning to gather along the Thames as we prepared for our confrontation with forces that had reached across oceans and years to claim their victims in the heart of civilized London. The Adelphi Terrace at nightfall possessed an atmosphere of brooding expectation, its Georgian facades looming like silent witnesses above the darkening Thames. The fog, which had been gathering strength throughout the afternoon, now rolled in thick banks from the river, transforming the familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions of their daytime selves. Holmes had positioned our forces with military precision, converting the elegant promenade into a carefully orchestrated trap for our elusive quarry. I found myself stationed behind the memorial column, wrapped in the rough coat of a night watchman, while Holmes had transformed himself into a riverside porter, his hands stained with coal dust and his cap pulled low over his sharp features. Lestrade, with two plainclothes constables, maintained positions at either end of the terrace, their presence carefully concealed among the shadows cast by the ornate lamp-posts. Whitmore, despite the pallor that betrayed his inattention, stood by the central parapet with admirable composure, the flat parcel Holmes had prepared resting beneath his greatcoat. Our adversary materialized from the fog with the silent efficiency of a practiced hunter, his approach so skillfully managed that even my trained observation nearly missed his emergence from the swirling mist. He was a man of scholarly bearing, wrapped in a dark ulster of continental cut, his face partially concealed by the upturned collar and the broad brim of his felt hat. The walking stick that Captain Davies had described was indeed carved with serpentine designs, its polished surface catching the lamplight with an almost hypnotic gleam that suggested more than mere decorative intent. The stranger did not approach Whitmore directly, but instead produced what appeared to be a small optical device, adjusting its focus until a thin beam of concentrated light fell upon our Confederate's position. Through this ingenious adaptation of magic lantern principles, he began communicating with Whitmore through a series of coded light patterns, maintaining complete control over the encounter while avoiding direct contact. The scholarly precision of this method confirmed Holmes's assessment that we faced an adversary whose knowledge extended far beyond common criminality. Holmes had anticipated such caution, and when the stranger finally approached the lamp-post with the confident stride of a man who believed himself in complete control, my friend struck with characteristic decisiveness. Emerging from the fog like an avenging spirit, he seized the man's wrist as the walking stick was raised toward Whitmore, revealing the implement's true nature as a spring-loaded weapon capable of projecting death with mechanical precision. The struggle that ensued was brief but violent, complicated by the fog that reduced visibility to mere yards and the treacherous footing of the wet pavement. Our adversary possessed the wiry strength and trained reflexes of a man accustomed to physical confrontation, but Holmes's superior knowledge of the mechanical principles involved gave him a decisive advantage. A sharp crack echoed across the terrace as the walking stick's concealed mechanism discharged harmlessly into the night, followed immediately by the metallic chime of small objects striking the pavement. In that critical moment, our quarry demonstrated the same methodical preparation that had characterized his other crimes. From the walking stick's ferrule, he released a fine, acrid powder that burst in our faces, causing eyes to water and throats to burn with the sharp sting of pepper and coal smoke combined. Through this chemical screen, he slipped over the parapet's coping with the agility of a cat, finding the river steps in the fog with unerring certainty that spoke of careful reconnaissance. "After him!" Lestrade cried, but Holmes's restraining hand was already upon the inspector's arm. "Let him go," he said with quiet authority. "We have achieved our primary objective." Upon the wet pavement lay the serpentine walking stick, its secrets now exposed to our examination. The hollow shaft contained a coil of fine, resin-treated cord wound upon a brass bobbin, together with a tiny claw of tempered steel designed to grip bolts or latches from considerable distances. The retractable blade in the head bore the hallmarks of continental manufacture, while the ferrule had concealed a reservoir of the irritant powder that had facilitated our quarry's escape. More significantly, scattered among the mechanical components were two jeweled pulleys no larger than my thumbnail, their precision craftsmanship speaking of the same attention to detail that had characterized the Corinthian Club modifications. A folded paper bearing exact measurements confirmed our suspicions: seat depth 18 in, bolt 4 in, above key, window, rebate, notch 316 in. Upon the corner was a neat monogram executed in violet pencil, the simple initial K, together with the imprint of a stationer in Villiers Street. Holmes examined these trophies with the satisfaction of a naturalist who had secured essential specimens. "Our friend has declared himself," he observed, his breath still visible in the cold air. "He carries his workshop in his walking stick and his theatre in his pocket. Note the pulleys, Watson. With such devices, one may transform a gentleman's club into a stage for murder and reduce a man's life to the tension of a carefully calibrated cord." Lestrade, nursing a shallow cut from the blade that had caught his sleeve, was less philosophical about our quarry's escape. "He's wounded me and vanished into the fog like a phantom," he growled. "What description do I circulate to the river police?" "For the present, the initial will suffice," Holmes replied, carefully collecting the scattered evidence. "Seek a man who favours lodgings with clear views of his intended targets, employs watermen rather than hansoms when speed is essential, and purchases his supplies from quality establishments in Villiers Street. Cast that net, and we shall see what manner of fish it brings to light." As we made our way back toward Baker Street through the dissipating fog, Holmes's manner carried the quiet confidence that marked his approach to problems whose solutions had begun to crystallize in his remarkable intellect. The mechanical evidence we had recovered provided crucial insights into both the method and the mind behind Percival Statham's impossible death, while the adversary's escape had been purchased at the cost of revealing his sophisticated preparations. "Watson," he said as our hansom carried us through the clearing night, "we have witnessed the collision between mechanical genius and criminal ambition, a combination that produces effects both remarkable and terrible. Our scholarly adversary has demonstrated that the most effective weapons are often those that appear entirely innocent to casual observation, but he has also revealed the fundamental weakness that afflicts all such elaborate schemes: the necessity of involving others in their execution, and the inevitable trail of evidence that such involvement creates." The fog continued to lift from the Thames, revealing the eternal outlines of London's architecture, but the mystery that had drawn us into its coils remained as complex as ever. We had gained crucial evidence and confirmed the existence of a formidable adversary, yet the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed Percival Statham's life was only beginning to reveal itself. The gentleman who never sat down had been avenged in part, but complete justice would require unravelling the remaining threads of a web that stretched from the exotic markets of Singapore to the respectable clubs of St. James's Street. The first light of dawn found Holmes at his chemical bench, the recovered walking stick dismantled before him with the methodical precision of a surgeon conducting a post-mortem examination. Each component lay arranged upon a sheet of foolscap like the scattered fragments of some diabolical puzzle, their individual purposes now revealed through careful analysis. The jewelled pulleys gleamed with mirror brightness, their bearings adjusted to operate without the slightest friction or sound, while the fine cord bore the telltale residue of rosin treatment that had marked every aspect of our investigation. "Observe the sophistication of this arrangement, Watson," Holmes murmured, his lens focused upon the miniature steel claw that had been concealed within the walking stick's ferrule. "This device represents months of careful preparation, each element designed to fulfill a specific function within a larger mechanical symphony. The pulleys are identical in construction to the fragments I discovered beneath the disputed chair at the Corinthian Club, confirming that the same hand prepared both the instrument and the stage for our drama." He then directed his attention to the folded measurements bearing the violet pencil monogram, comparing the paper's texture and watermark with specimens from our previous investigations. The Villiers Street stationer's mark provides our most promising avenue of inquiry. A man who commissioned such bespoke mechanical devices yet maintains accounts with common tradesmen suggests a curious blend of sophistication and practical necessity. Our expedition to Villiers Street proved immediately fruitful, as Mr. Aldrich, the establishment's proprietor, possessed the careful records that mark a businessman who understands the value of discretion. The violet pencil monogram had, indeed, been executed in his shop as part of extensive purchases by a gentleman who identified himself as Professor Heinrich Gruber, a scholar of mechanical engineering with interests in Oriental craftsmanship. The professor had been a regular customer for the past 18 months, commissioning specialized drawing papers, precision instruments, and detailed architectural surveys that Aldrich now recognized as representing the interior arrangements of the Corinthian Club. Holmes examined these commissioned drawings with intense fascination, noting the meticulous accuracy with which every detail of the reading room had been documented. The positions of furniture, the dimensions of windows and doors, the precise location of gas fittings and heating apparatus, all had been recorded with the thoroughness of a military engineer preparing for siege operations. Most revealing were the marginal calculations in violet pencil, computing angles of approach, mechanical advantages, and what appeared to be timing sequences for coordinated operations. "Professor Gruber," Holmes repeated thoughtfully as we emerged into the morning air. The name carries echoes of a case that troubled the commercial courts some years past. "Watson, do you recall the Singapore arbitration involving Oriental mechanical furniture?" My memory, though reliable in matters of immediate concern, required assistance with the details of decade-old legal proceedings. Holmes, however, possessed that remarkable faculty for retaining seemingly unrelated information until the moment when its significance became apparent. From his coat pocket he produced a carefully folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age but still legible, that detailed a complex dispute involving the acquisition of rare artifacts from the Far East. The article described how Percival Statham, acting as financial agent for a consortium of collectors, had leveraged his position to acquire an entire shipment of mechanical curiosities at a drastically reduced price from a distressed merchant. The original owner, Professor Heinrich Gruber, had been ruined by the transaction, his reputation destroyed, and his scholarly career terminated through circumstances that the court had deemed legally sound but morally questionable. "The timing is perfect," Holmes observed with quiet satisfaction. The arbitration concluded precisely 10 years ago, coinciding exactly with the onset of Percival Statham's peculiar aversion to chairs. Our gentleman who never sat down was not merely eccentric, Watson, but profoundly traumatized by the very instruments he had so ruthlessly acquired. The revelation transformed our understanding of the entire mystery with startling clarity. Professor Gruber had not merely sought revenge upon Statham, but had crafted a punishment of exquisite psychological precision. The mechanical chair that had claimed Statham's life was not simply a murder weapon, but the very device whose theft had haunted the victim's conscience for a decade. The elaborate preparations, the locked room, the impossible circumstances, all had been designed to force Statham into confronting the instrument of his past crimes in the moment of his death. "The parcel that arrived on Statham's final evening," I ventured, the pieces falling into place with mathematical precision, contained some component or diagram of the original chair mechanism, a reminder of his past transgressions and a direct threat of retribution. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed. Gruber's communication was both psychological warfare and practical preparation. Statham's agitation, his hasty destruction of the parcel, and his subsequent retreat to the reading room were all predictable reactions to such a profound assault upon his conscience. Our adversary understood his victim's character with the intimacy that only sustained hatred can provide. Our analysis was interrupted by Lestrade's arrival with intelligence that elevated our investigation from historical reconstruction to immediate peril. Whitmore had been discovered dead in his Riverside office, the circumstances bearing the unmistakable signature of Professor Gruber's methodical elimination of witnesses. The night watchman sat upon a packing case as if peacefully asleep, his death accomplished through the same mechanical precision that had characterized Statham's demise. Holmes's examination of the scene revealed the familiar traces of rosin compound and the telltale marks of cord manipulation, confirming that Gruber was systematically removing all evidence of his elaborate conspiracy. Among the rifled papers, only a triangular fragment remained, bearing the words Paramaribo Koppel in smeared ink, a final clue connecting the mechanical preparations to the very trade that Statham and Whitmore had prosecuted. Koppel, Holmes explained as we returned to Baker Street, the resin of commerce that becomes the varnish of precision instruments. Our adversary supplied himself from the very sources that his victims controlled, turning their own business connections into the means of their destruction. The afternoon brought Geoffrey Statham to our lodgings, his anxiety evident despite the police protection that now accompanied his movements. He carried a square parcel that had arrived by private messenger, wrapped in the same brown paper we had traced throughout our investigation. Holmes examined the package with extreme care, noting the amber wax seal impressed with a smooth signet bearing the initial G. Within lay a blank sheet of translucent foolscap, a small coil of resin-treated cord, and a violet pencil, the tools of Gruber's deadly craft presented as a macabre gift. When Holmes held the blank paper near the warmth of our lamp, a message appeared in pale brown lettering. "The seat kept for a friend is now yours, G." Holmes's expression grew grave as he rewrapped the parcel with methodical care. "Professor Gruber believes we cannot move quickly enough to forestall his final act. He is mistaken. Tonight, Watson, we return to the Corinthian Club. The gentleman who never sat down has taught us much about the relationship between guilt and mechanical precision, but the lesson is not yet complete." As evening shadows gathered across London's ancient stones, I reflected upon the extraordinary revelation that had transformed our understanding of the case. What had appeared to be an impossible crime had revealed itself as an act of precisely calculated justice, administered by a man whose scholarly brilliance had been perverted by years of brooding revenge. The locked room, the mechanical chair, the elaborate preparations, all represented the culmination of a decade-long campaign to force Percival Statham into confronting the consequences of his past actions. Yet Professor Gruber's quest for vengeance had transformed him into something far more dangerous than his original victim. The systematic elimination of accomplices, the threats against Geoffrey Statham, and the mechanical sophistication of his methods marked him as an adversary whose scholarly facade concealed the calculating mind of a master criminal. The final confrontation that awaited us would test not merely our ability to solve puzzles, but our capacity to prevent a brilliant mind from completing its transformation into an instrument of methodical destruction. The fog was beginning to gather along the Thames as Holmes prepared his equipment for what he clearly anticipated would be the decisive encounter of our investigation. The gentleman who never sat down would be avenged, but the price of that justice might yet claim additional victims unless we could match Professor Gruber's mechanical genius with the focused application of English determination and logical deduction. The return to the Corinthian Club in the deepest hours of night transformed the familiar chambers into something approaching a battlefield prepared by the most meticulous of generals. Holmes had spent the intervening hours in correspondence with Lestrade, arranging a coordination of forces that would have impressed a military strategist, while simultaneously preparing the mechanical countermeasures that his analysis of Professor Gruber's methods had made possible. The fog that rolled up from the Thames provided perfect cover for the movements of constables who took their positions with the silent efficiency of seasoned campaigners. Holmes's preparations in the small reading room represented a masterwork of tactical anticipation. Beneath the disputed chair, he wedged thin cork slips at precisely those points where his examination had revealed the hidden mechanism's pressure plates, ensuring that any activation would produce a distinctive warning sound without endangering a human occupant. A wafer of coloured gelatine, no thicker than paper, stretched across the inner face of the door's bolt, positioned so that the slightest external manipulation would snap it, and drop a small metal pellet into a china saucer placed within the fireplace grate. The window received the most delicate of his warning systems, a single hair drawn taut across the narrowest portion of the frame's rebate, its ends secured with a varnish that would crackle audibly if disturbed. A faint dusting of flour upon the sill would record the passage of any cord or implement, while lamp black applied to the chair's arms and the door key would preserve the fingerprints of anyone bold enough to make direct contact with the evidence. Geoffrey Statham, despite his evident anxiety, had insisted upon playing a role in the evening's proceedings, though Holmes had firmly rejected any suggestion that he occupy the deadly chair. Instead, a carefully arranged figure composed of weighted cushions and a club overcoat sat in the fatal seat, its newspaper positioned to display the shipping intelligence, and its hat tilted at the natural angle of a gentleman absorbed in his reading. "Our professor possesses the methodical mind of a true scholar," Holmes observed, as we took our positions behind the substantial bookcase that commanded a clear view of both window and door. "He will approach his final demonstration with the same precision that has marked all his previous work. We have merely provided him with a stage that appears to meet his requirements while concealing the machinery of his own capture." Lestrade's forces were positioned with equal care throughout the surrounding area. 2 constables waited in the service lane with their boots wrapped in sacking to muffle any sound, while a third occupied the attic window of the lodging house from which Gruber had previously operated. The water gate at the lane's terminus was watched by river police, whose intimate knowledge of London's waterways would prevent any escape by boat. Within the club itself, Pike maintained his vigil in the main hall, ensuring that no servant would inadvertently disturb our carefully prepared trap. The hours between midnight and dawn possess a quality of expectant silence that seems to amplify the smallest sounds into events of profound significance. The bracket clock in the library marked each quarter hour with mechanical precision, while the settling of the building's ancient timbers created a symphony of creaks and whispers that might have concealed the approach of an army. Holmes remained motionless as carved marble, his attention focused with laser-like intensity upon the various warning systems he had deployed. The first indication of Professor Gruber's presence came at precisely 20 minutes past 2, when the hair stretched across the window frame produced the faintest musical complaint, a gossamer note that would have escaped any ear less trained than Holmes's. Almost immediately thereafter, the gelatine wafer spanning the bolt's interior face parted with a soft click, and the metal pellet rang once as it struck the waiting saucer. The mechanical genius who had devoted a decade to perfecting his instrument of revenge was beginning his final performance. Through the infinitesimal gap that appeared as the window sash rose no more than a knife's breadth, there slid a cord so fine that only the flower upon the sill betrayed its passage. This line, treated with the same rosin compound we had traced throughout our investigation, descended with the precision of a surgeon's suture to engage the door key's bow. The lampblack recorded the contact in unmistakable traceries as the key turned slowly in its lock, followed by the whispered withdrawal of the bolt. The chair's concealed mechanism responded to its external activation with the cork-muffled creak that Holmes had anticipated, and our carefully arranged dummy figure tipped forward in apparent capitulation to the fatal comfort that had claimed Percival Statham. From our concealed position, we could observe the cord's tension increasing as Professor Gruber, believing his trap successfully sprung, began the gradual process that would compress his victim into unconsciousness and death. "Now," Holmes breathed, and the reading room exploded into illumination as every gas jet blazed to life simultaneously. Lestrade's boots thundered in the corridor while his constables converged upon the service lane with coordinated precision. At the same instant, the window above us revealed a dark silhouette against the night sky as Professor Gruber attempted to withdraw his mechanical apparatus and escape across the rooftops. Holmes had anticipated this final gambit, and his preparations extended beyond the reading room itself. As Gruber's figure appeared upon the opposite building's parapet, moving with the desperate agility of a man whose elaborate plans had collapsed into chaos, he found his retreat blocked by the constable who had been positioned in the garret window. The brief struggle that ensued upon the slippery tiles ended with the sharp crack of a truncheon meeting skull, followed by the metallic clang of a body striking the lead guttering. When they brought Professor Heinrich Gruber into the reading room between two stalwart constables, his scholarly appearance remained largely intact despite his violent capture. The dark eyes that had once focused upon mechanical precision now carried the glitter of a man whose intellectual pride had become his destruction. He shook free of Lestrade's restraining grasp with surprising dignity and regarded Holmes with the weary curiosity of a mathematician examining an unexpected solution to a familiar equation. "So, Mr. Holmes," he said, in accented English that carried the precise articulation of continental education, "you have learned to speak the language of mechanical precision. I confess admiration for your methodology, though I question your ultimate conclusions." "Professor Heinrich Gruber," Holmes replied with frigid courtesy, "your mechanical genius has been matched only by your failure to understand that revenge, however precisely calibrated, inevitably destroys its architect as thoroughly as its intended victim. You have translated a decade of brilliant scholarship into a single night's criminal folly." Gruber's gaze moved to the dummy figure still seated in his deadly chair, then to the various detection devices that had betrayed his approach, and finally to the cord that dangled uselessly from the window frame. For the first time since his capture, his scholarly composure faltered as the full extent of his defeat became apparent. 10 years, he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of obsession, finally exhausted. 10 years of preparation, of mechanical refinement, of patient observation. And you have reduced it all to parlor tricks and police constables. "You reduced it yourself," Holmes answered quietly, "the moment you chose to employ your considerable talents in the service of personal vengeance rather than human knowledge. The gentleman who never sat down was indeed guilty of ruthless acquisition, but your response has transformed you into something far worse than your original victim." As they led Professor Gruber away to face the justice he had sought to administer through mechanical precision, Holmes examined the elaborate apparatus that had been recovered from the scene, the chair's hidden mechanisms, the treated cords, the system of pulleys and counterweights, all represented a level of sophistication that transcended common criminality and entered the realm of diabolical artistry. "Watson," he said as dawn began to penetrate the fog that had shrouded our night's work, "we have witnessed the collision between mechanical genius and moral corruption, a combination that produces effects both remarkable and terrible." Professor Gruber's scholarly brilliance was perverted by his inability to distinguish between justice and revenge, transforming him from a seeker of knowledge into an instrument of methodical destruction. The case of the gentleman who never sat down had reached its conclusion. but the lessons it taught about the relationship between guilt, mechanical precision, and the corrupting power of sustained hatred would remain with us long after the fog had lifted from London's ancient stones. Percival Statham's eccentric refusal to occupy chairs had been revealed as the manifestation of a conscience haunted by past crimes, while Professor Gruber's elaborate revenge had demonstrated that the pursuit of perfect justice often becomes indistinguishable from the very evils it seeks to punish. As we emerged into the clearing morning air, I reflected upon the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with an impossible death in a locked room and concluded with the capture of a mechanical genius whose scholarly pursuits had been transformed into instruments of murder. The locked room had yielded its secrets to patient observation, the impossible circumstances had revealed their mechanical basis, and the gentleman who never sat down had been avenged by those who refused to allow injustice to masquerade as scholarly precision. The grey light of dawn transformed the Corinthian Club's reading room from a stage of mechanical murder into a laboratory for Holmes's most brilliant reconstruction. With Professor Gruber secured between two constables, his scholarly dignity intact despite his violent capture, Holmes began the methodical demonstration that would illuminate every aspect of this extraordinary crime. The various warning systems he had deployed lay scattered about the chamber like the components of some vast clockwork, each having played its part in revealing the mechanical genius that had been turned to such deadly purpose. Holmes positioned himself beside the fatal chair, his long fingers tracing the hidden channels and concealed mechanisms with the delicate touch of a surgeon examining a patient. "Observe, gentlemen, how 10 years of patient preparation culminated in a single night's work," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that marked his most significant revelations. Professor Gruber's parcel contained not merely threats, but precise instructions calculated to exploit Mr. Statham's deepest fears while ensuring his compliance with the murderer's requirements. The reconstruction proceeded with mathematical precision, as Holmes demonstrated how the treated cord had passed through the window's carefully prepared notch over the jeweled pulleys concealed within the chair's framework and connected to the door's locking mechanism. The amber wax upon the bolt, far from being a servant's careless application, had been Statham's own desperate attempt to follow Gruber's instructions for securing the room against imagined threats. The very precautions that promised safety had advertised to the waiting murderer that his victim had positioned himself precisely as required. "The chair itself represents a masterwork of concealed engineering," Holmes continued, pressing the cushion to demonstrate the mechanism's response. Hidden springs and counterweights activated by external manipulation gradually increased pressure upon specific anatomical points until consciousness was lost and death ensued. The victim would appear to observers as having dozed peacefully, the mechanical compression leaving no visible marks while accomplishing its fatal purpose with scientific precision. Professor Gruber listened to this exposition with the detached interest of a scholar attending a lecture on his own specialty, his dark eyes following every gesture as Holmes revealed the secrets of his decade-long preparation. When the reconstruction was complete, he spoke with the measured cadence of academic discourse, though his words carried the weight of profound bitterness. "Mr. Holmes," he said in accented English that retained its continental precision despite the circumstances, "you demonstrate admirable understanding of mechanical principles. Perhaps you can also appreciate the mathematics of justice. Percival Statham stole 10 years from my life, destroyed my reputation, and reduced my life's work to commercial speculation. I have returned those years to him, measured out in precise mechanical increments." Holmes regarded the professor with that mixture of intellectual respect and moral condemnation that marked his encounters with criminal genius. "You were indeed a superior mathematician, Professor Gruber, but a deficient moralist. Time does not balance upon pulleys, nor does justice operate through hidden springs. Your mechanical brilliance has been perverted by your inability to distinguish between legal remedy and personal vengeance. The formal legal proceedings that followed provided London society with a sensation that combined intellectual fascination with moral complexity. Professor Gruber's confession, delivered with scholarly precision, revealed the full scope of his campaign for revenge. The theft of his mechanical collection during the Singapore voyage had represented not merely financial loss, but the destruction of 20 years' scholarly work in Oriental mechanical arts. Percival Statham's ruthless acquisition of the distressed cargo, while legally sound, had been morally questionable, transforming Gruber from respected academic into ruined exile with nothing but his technical knowledge and consuming desire for retribution. The systematic preparation for Statham's death had begun 3 years prior, when Gruber first learned of his victim's peculiar aversion to chairs. This psychological vulnerability had provided the perfect foundation for revenge that would force Statham to confront the very instruments whose acquisition had haunted his conscience. The elaborate mechanical preparations, the careful study of the club's architecture, the cultivation of Thomas Cribbs as unwitting accomplice, all had been designed to create circumstances that would appear impossible to ordinary investigation while satisfying Gruber's need for poetic justice. Geoffrey Statham's reaction to these revelations demonstrated the complex relationship between justice and family loyalty. While horrified by the mechanical sophistication of his uncle's murder, he acknowledged the moral ambiguity of Percival's original actions. The Singapore arbitration had indeed been conducted within legal bounds, but the human cost had been profound, transforming a brilliant mind into an instrument of methodical vengeance. Lestrade's official report credited the solution to methodical police work supplemented by expert consultation, a diplomatic formulation that satisfied administrative requirements while respecting Holmes's preference for avoiding excessive public attention. The inspector had learned much from observing Holmes's analytical methods, particularly the importance of examining physical evidence with scientific precision rather than relying upon conventional assumptions about criminal behavior. The trial of Professor Heinrich, Gruber provided a sensation that would be discussed in London's clubs and drawing rooms for years to come. The defendant's scholarly bearing and obvious intelligence created sympathy among those who appreciated the injustice he had suffered, while his mechanical ingenuity and systematic elimination of accomplices demonstrated the dangerous transformation of academic brilliance into criminal methodology. The judge's sentencing remarks reflected this moral ambiguity, acknowledging Gruber's grievances while condemning his choice to pursue private vengeance rather than legal remedy. The mechanical apparatus recovered from the scene underwent exhaustive analysis, revealing layers of sophistication that continued to astonish even those familiar with the professor's scholarly reputation. The deadly chair was eventually destroyed under official supervision, its secrets consigned to flames, though detailed records were maintained for future investigative reference. Holmes recommended that the intact specimens from the original Oriental collection be donated to the British Museum, where they could serve scholarly purposes rather than criminal ones. As autumn settled over London and the familiar rhythms of Baker Street life resumed their comfortable patterns, I found Holmes seated, yes, seated by our fire, his long fingers absently manipulating a length of ordinary twine, as if the simple texture offered an antidote to the diabolical contrivances we had witnessed. The intellectual challenges posed by Professor Gruber's elaborate preparations had engaged his analytical faculties at their highest level, while the moral complexities of the situation had provided philosophical stimulation that mere puzzle-solving could not supply. "Watson," he said one evening, looking up from his contemplation with that rare gentleness which his most demanding cases sometimes evoked, "we have witnessed the collision between mechanical genius and moral corruption, a combination that produces effects both remarkable and terrible. Professor Gruber's scholarly brilliance was perverted by his inability to distinguish between justice and revenge, transforming him from seeker of knowledge into instrument of methodical destruction. Yet surely, I ventured, there was some justice in his grievances. Statham's acquisition of the collection was ruthless, even if legally sound. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, but observe how the pursuit of perfect retribution corrupted even the most brilliant mind. Gruber walked a labyrinth of his own construction where I followed the straight road of logical deduction. The fault lay not in his mechanical genius, Watson, but in his choice to employ that genius in service of personal hatred rather than human knowledge. He rose then, reaching for his violin with the restless energy that marked his return to ordinary concerns. The gentleman who never sat down has taught us something profound about the relationship between guilt and mechanical precision, but the lesson extends far beyond locked rooms and hidden springs. In our advancing age of mechanical marvels, we must remain vigilant against those who would transform the instruments of progress into weapons of personal vengeance. As the familiar strains of Sarasate filled our sitting room, I reflected upon the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with an impossible death and concluded with revelations that challenged fundamental assumptions about justice, revenge, and the proper application of human ingenuity. The case files were sealed in Holmes's private collection, joining the growing archive of investigations that had revealed the darker applications of scientific knowledge while demonstrating that no crime, however cleverly conceived, could ultimately withstand the patient application of logical deduction. The fog had lifted from London's ancient stones, but the lessons learned in that small reading room would remain with us always. A reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who possess the intelligence to transform ordinary objects into instruments of death, and that the pursuit of justice must never be confused with the satisfaction of personal vengeance, however mechanically precise its execution might be. Holmes tucked his bow beneath his chin and drew from the strings a phrase so clear and inevitable that for a moment the whole tangled matter seemed resolved in pure sound. The gentleman who never sat down had found his rest at last, while those who had learned from his tragedy continued their vigilant watch against the mechanical demons that lurk within the advancing machinery of our modern civilization. The winter months that followed Professor Gruber's capture brought a curious epilogue to our investigation, one that would illuminate the final mysteries surrounding the gentleman who never sat down. Geoffrey Statham arrived at Baker Street on a particularly bitter February morning, carrying a leather portfolio discovered within a secret compartment of his uncle's escritoire. The documents within revealed the complete correspondence between Percival Statham and Professor Gruber, a tragic exchange that had begun 3 years prior with attempted reconciliation and gradually deteriorated into the mechanical precision of mutual destruction. My uncle was not merely the ruthless speculator we believed him to be, Geoffrey explained, his voice heavy with revelation. These letters show a man haunted by his actions, one who spent his final years attempting to make amends. His refusal to sit was not mere eccentricity, but self-imposed penance, a daily reminder of the mechanical instruments whose acquisition had destroyed another man's life. Holmes examined the correspondence with intense concentration, discovering that Statham's initial communication had acknowledged the moral questionability of his Singapore acquisition, offering substantial compensation and the return of key pieces from the Oriental collection. Gruber's response had rejected monetary settlement while proposing an alternative form of justice that would satisfy what he termed the mathematical requirements of retribution. The final letter, dated mere days before Statham's death, contained his acceptance of Gruber's proposed demonstration of mechanical justice. This document revealed the true relationship between victim and murderer, Statham had not been trapped by superior cunning, but had willingly participated in his own destruction, believing such cooperation would satisfy the professor's demand for retribution while protecting other potential victims. Your uncle chose to become the final component in Professor Gruber's mechanical symphony, Holmes observed with quiet gravity. The locked room was not a trap, but a stage upon which both men could enact their interpretation of justice according to principles that transcended ordinary legal remedy. The trial of Professor Heinrich Gruber became one of the most talked-about legal spectacles of the era. Maintaining his scholarly composure throughout, he presented his defense as a logical extension of his grievances, arguing for intellectual justice that transcended mere legal statutes. His articulate explanations of the chair's mechanism and decade-long planning captivated the courtroom, revealing a mind of formidable brilliance, warped by singular obsession. Though his arguments held perverse intellectual appeal, the systematic elimination of accomplices ensured the law saw only murder, however cleverly disguised. Following his conviction, the mechanical apparatus was dismantled and destroyed under government order, its blueprints filed in secure vaults deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. The remaining Oriental collection was donated to the British Museum, where it could serve scholarly purposes rather than becoming instruments of further tragedy. Holmes personally supervised their installation, ensuring appropriate warnings accompanied each display regarding the potential dangers of mechanical ingenuity divorced from moral restraint. As spring returned to London and familiar rhythms resumed at Baker Street, I often observed Holmes seated by our fire, his fingers absently manipulating ordinary objects, as if their simple functionality offered reassurance after witnessing such elaborate perversions of mechanical principle. The intellectual challenges posed by Professor Gruber's preparations had engaged his analytical faculties at their highest level, while the moral complexities had provided philosophical stimulation that mere puzzle-solving could never supply. "Watson," he said one evening as twilight gathered beyond our windows, "we have learned something profound about the relationship between brilliance and corruption, between mechanical precision and moral purpose." The gentleman who never sat down was indeed guilty of ruthless acquisition, but his willingness to accept the consequences elevated him above his tormentor, who transformed legitimate grievance into systematic murder. The violin case lay closed upon his desk, its presence a reminder of harmony achieved when human skill serves beauty rather than destruction. "In our advancing age of mechanical marvels," Holmes continued, "we must remain vigilant against those who would employ the instruments of progress in service of personal hatred. The most dangerous criminals are often those who possess the intelligence to justify their actions through elaborate philosophical systems while losing sight of fundamental moral principles." The fog had lifted permanently from this particular mystery, leaving behind lessons that would inform future investigations while serving as warning against the seductive appeal of perfect revenge. The locked room had yielded its secrets to patient observation, the impossible circumstances had revealed their mechanical basis, and the gentleman who never sat down had found his final rest in the knowledge that justice, however imperfect, had ultimately prevailed over the systematic pursuit of personal vengeance. As I sealed the case file within Holmes's private collection, I reflected upon the strange justice that had been accomplished. Percival Statham had found his peace, Professor Gruber had achieved his revenge at the cost of his own destruction, and London society had been reminded that the most ordinary objects could conceal extraordinary dangers when manipulated by minds that had chosen hatred over wisdom. The chair remained destroyed, its secrets consigned to official records, but the lesson it embodied would endure as long as human ingenuity continued to serve both noble and terrible purposes in the endless struggle between construction and destruction, between justice and revenge, between mechanical precision and moral reasoning, guided by unwavering dedication to truth.